Welcome to the debate. Today, we are diving into a document that raises a disturbing question. How much demographic pressure can European states absorb before public services weaken, political trust erodes, and social consensus begins to fracture? Welcome to a new Strategic Labs deep dive. Check the links in the description.
Yeah, it's a genuinely striking provocation, and honestly, a necessary one.
Absolutely.
We are looking at a concise but incredibly dense piece of source material today that fundamentally recharacterizes Europe's migration challenge. I mean, it pulls no punches.
It really doesn't.
It explicitly states that this is no longer a temporary emergency. The era of, viewing this through the lens of a passing storm is over. Instead, it has evolved into a permanent structural stress test on the continent's institutions.
Exactly. And that shift from a fleeting crisis to a permanent structural reality, it forces a massive recalibration of how we understand state responsibility.
Right.
Because these public systems, whether we are talking about healthcare, education, or housing, they were originally designed for short-term crisis management.
Yeah, emergency measures.
Right, and they are now under permanent strain. So we have to ask, what is the proper institutional response? I'll be arguing that the text demands a complete paradigm shift toward fundamentally redesigning and, well, honestly, infinitely expanding our internal civic infrastructure. If this is a permanent reality, we just have to build the capacity to meet it.
And I will be taking the opposing view here. The text explicitly warns about how much pressure can be absorbed, which, to me, dictates a hard, mathematical limit to governance.
Okay, but
You cannot infinitely expand domestic capacity to meet an infinitely expanding global phenomenon. Ultimately, that structural strain necessitates a return to limiting arrivals.
well, let's jump right into why the old frameworks are failing us then. The source material essentially rings a death knell for the classic humanitarian obligation versus security debate.
It does.
It explicitly calls that framework increasingly insufficient, and I think the reason why is really profound. Both of those concepts, humanitarian rescue on one side, national security on the other, they are entirely obsessed with the border.
Yes, they treat the migrant as someone perpetually at the threshold.
Exactly. But the text pivots us away from that threshold, stating the issue is no longer only about border control. It lists the actual arenas of impact, housing capacity, labor markets, schools, hospitals, welfare systems, and policing.
Right, the domestic sphere.
Yeah, since arrivals across the Mediterranean and eastern routes continue as a structural reality, the state's duty is to proactively upgrade its short-term crisis systems into permanent public service infrastructure.
Well, I come at it from a different way. While I completely agree that the text moves past the old humanitarian versus security binary, I look at the exact wording of its central question.
Which part?
The part where it asks, how much pressure can European states absorb? It is introducing the concept of a breaking point. It warns of a very specific, cascading sequence of failures.
The erosion of trust.
Right. First, public services weaken, then political trust erodes, and finally, social consensus begins to fracture. To me, this implies that institutional capacity is strictly finite. Yes, the text rightly identifies migration as a governance issue deeply intertwined with hospitals and schools, but it does so as a warning. It suggests that failing to address the continuous arrivals will eventually overwhelm even the most meticulously designed domestic institutions. I mean, it's a matter of physics and economics. Capacity has a ceiling.
I think we need to unpack what a structural stress test actually means in practice, though, because that phrase does a lot of heavy lifting in the text.
Sure.
Whether you are looking at banking regulations after a financial crisis or, say, software engineering, a stress test isn't designed to tell you to shut down the bank or turn off the software.
Okay.
It is designed to expose exactly where your structural vulnerabilities are so that you can capitalize and reinforce them. If schools and hospitals are under permanent strain, the stress test is revealing that our current baseline of civic funding is artificially low for the new permanent demographic reality. The structure itself must be fundamentally altered.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. Let's borrow an analogy from civil engineering, since we are talking about structural stress.
Go ahead.
If an architectural bridge is undergoing a structural stress test from excessive, continuous weight, engineers don't simply assume they can infinitely reinforce the bridge while the traffic increases exponentially forever.
Well, a state isn't a bridge, but
Let me finish the thought. They don't just keep adding steel cables while completely ignoring the volume of cars on the roadway. Eventually, they have to regulate the traffic. They put up a sign that says maximum load.
okay, I see where you're going.
The text explicitly asks how much pressure can be absorbed, which inherently implies a hard limit before failure. I mean, our listeners in local government are probably intimately familiar with this reality. When a municipality suddenly has to absorb a 10% population increase, a mayor cannot just reinforce the bridge.
Right.
You cannot infinitely reinforce the hospital system or the housing market if the demand is entirely uncoupled from predictable economic planning.
Okay, I'll admit, the sheer math of municipal budgeting in a 5-year window is incredibly daunting. You cannot just snap your fingers and magically manifest a fully staffed school or a high-density housing block.
Exactly.
But I want to push back on the bridge analogy. Because a state is not a static steel structure. It is an organic, dynamic economic engine. When you add people to a society, you don't just add passive weight, you add builders.
If they are allowed to work, yes.
You add consumers, taxpayers, and laborers. The text specifically mentions labor markets alongside hospitals and schools. If European states adapt their labor markets effectively, the people crossing those routes become the very workforce that expands housing capacity and staffs the hospitals.
That is,
The stress test is only failed if the state remains frozen in short-term crisis management mode, treating new arrivals as permanent dependents rather than future contributors.
Your point about migrants being builders rather than passive weight is an optimistic way to look at it. However, you are completely ignoring the timeline of institutional adaptation.
How so?
this is exactly why the text warns that public services weaken first. The time lag between a demographic shock, thousands of new arrivals in a single season, and those individuals becoming net contributing tax-paying nurses and construction workers is measured in years, often decades.
Well, integration does take time.
Exactly. We are talking about the time required to learn a new language, have foreign credentials recognized, or acquire new skills entirely. In the interim, they require immediate housing, welfare, policing, and schooling.
Sure, but
Builders need tools, time, and raw materials, and while they are supposedly building this new capacity, the bridge is still bearing the immediate load. The text is pointing out that this time lag is the exact friction point where the system breaks down. It's during that multi-year gap that local municipal budgets crash and political trust erodes.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the final line of the text. I think it addresses this exact lag time perfectly.
Okay, what's your read on it?
It states, migration is no longer just a border issue. It has become a governance issue. This is a definitive call to stop obsessing over the border as the primary mechanism of state control. Border control is almost framed here as a distraction from the real work. The real work is civic administration and public service allocation. If a state focuses all its political capital on stopping arrivals, a task the text implies is failing since arrivals continue, it neglects the complex governance required to actually shorten that lag time you just mentioned.
But how does governance shorten the lag time if the physical resources aren't there?
Because the bottleneck isn't always physical. Often, it's bureaucratic. Governance means updating archaic zoning laws to rapidly build high-density housing instead of letting development stall in red tape.
Okay, zoning reform is one piece.
It means creating fast-track language and credentialing programs so a foreign-trained doctor isn't driving a taxi for 5 years while a hospital remains understaffed. Governance means managing the reality on the ground, not chasing the fantasy of a hermetically sealed border.
That's a compelling argument. But have you considered that governance fundamentally requires a managed border?
I don't think it necessarily does.
But governance isn't just agile domestic administration. It is the ability to align demographic inflows with physical reality. You cannot govern what you cannot measure or limit.
I mean, you can measure it without stopping it.
Anyone listening who understands public economics knows that the modern European welfare state functions fundamentally like an insurance pool. It relies on a highly predictable, delicate mathematical equilibrium, a specific ratio of lifetime taxpayers to beneficiaries.
Right.
The fact that the text lists strained institutions like welfare systems, policing, schools, it proves that the border issue hasn't been transcended at all. It has simply spilled over into domestic life.
But that spillage is exactly what we need to manage.
But you can't manage it if the input is unregulated. An inability to control the border is the root failure of governance. Injecting millions of immediate beneficiaries into an insurance pool without a corresponding immediate increase in premiums paid will bankrupt the pool, regardless of how efficient your credentialing programs are.
I think that's a bit hyperbolic.
It's not, though. When a local mayor suddenly has to house 1,000 people in community gymnasiums because the national border policies failed, that is not a transition to governance. That is the collapse of governance, which leads exactly to the erosion of political trust the text warns about. National governments might sign the treaties, but it's the local municipalities that have to find the beds, and they are drowning.
But notice how the text frames that failure. It explicitly states that systems originally designed for short-term crisis management now operate under permanent strain.
Yes, the permanent strain.
Right. So the failure of governance isn't that people are arriving. The failure is the institutional stubbornness of the state. The state is trying to handle a permanent demographic shift using temporary tools.
Because they don't have permanent tools for unlimited people.
But putting people in gymnasiums is the definition of short-term crisis management. The threat to social consensus doesn't come from the migrants themselves. It comes from the state's refusal to transition away from emergency thinking. If states refuse to adapt their housing and labor markets to a permanent phenomenon, that refusal is what causes public services to weaken.
I have to challenge the idea that the threat is merely institutional stubbornness. Look at the sequence of the warning again. The central question is institutional capacity. How much pressure can European states absorb before public services weaken?
Yeah.
The casualty of sustained demographic pressure is the welfare state itself. The reason the old debate of humanitarian obligation versus security is insufficient is because neither side realized that the true victim of sustained demographic pressure would be the domestic social contract.
I hear you, but
No amount of proactive governance or agile zoning laws can invent infinite land or bypass the fundamental cost of healthcare in the short term. The fracturing of social consensus isn't caused by a lack of government creativity. It is an inevitable mathematical outcome of unchecked continued arrivals drawing on finite public resources.
I'm just not convinced by that line of reasoning because it assumes that institutional capacity is a fixed pie, and history simply doesn't support that.
History.
Yes. Look at rapid urbanization during the Industrial Revolution. Millions of people moved into cities that were completely unequipped to handle them.
That's true.
The cities didn't respond by closing their borders to rural migrants. They responded with massive governance shifts. They built sanitation systems, subways, and higher density housing. State capacity scales with population if governed correctly. By listing housing capacity, labor markets, schools, hospitals, welfare systems, and policing, the author isn't just cataloging vulnerabilities. They are providing the exact blueprint for where governance must now direct its energy.
But internal migration within a single linguistic and cultural economic zone is fundamentally different from international migration that requires massive immediate integration resources.
The logistical challenges are different, sure.
And again, managing the new reality must include acknowledging absolute limits. You say institutional capacity is not a fixed pie, and over a century, perhaps you're right. But over a 5-year electoral cycle, it absolutely is. The social consensus of a modern European state relies on deep psychological trust. Citizens are willing to pay nearly half their income in taxes because they believe the system is reciprocal, carefully managed, and exists to protect them. When the system operates under permanent strain due to external demographic pressure, citizens perceive a total loss of control over the insurance pool they paid into.
And I completely agree that citizens need to feel the system is managed. But I draw a different conclusion about how you achieve that trust.
How so?
The social consensus fractures precisely when citizens feel their government is paralyzed by the old debates, fighting over border walls while the hospitals remain understaffed, rather than actively managing the new reality. If you accept the text's premise that arrivals are a structural reality, then fighting the structure is futile.
Right.
You have to build a stronger society capable of handling it. Political trust is rebuilt when the state proves it can handle the reality on the ground efficiently.
Efficiently, yes, but within limits. The text speaks of the ability of societies to maintain cohesion under sustained demographic pressure. It is not writing a blueprint for utopian expansion.
I'm not saying it's utopian.
Sustained pressure without relief causes fractures. It is a profound warning that the rubber band is about to snap. You cannot ask a population to endure permanent strain on their daily public services without expecting a political backlash.
And yet, if the rubber band is snapping, the text suggests it is because we are trying to stretch a short-term crisis mechanism over a long-term structural reality. It seems we've actually reached a point of convergence on the core diagnostic premise here.
I think we have, yeah.
Treating the current situation as a temporary emergency using short-term tools is a catastrophic failure.
Absolutely. On that, the text is undeniable, and I think we are in complete lockstep. The era of viewing this through the lens of a passing anomaly is over. The strain is a permanent feature of the European landscape, and the ad hoc emergency measures of the past decade are completely bankrupt.
Right. Where we diverge is the prescription hidden within that diagnosis. If I were to distill what this source material is demanding, I read it as a mandate for a permanent evolution in European institutional capacity.
Because of the shift in focus?
Exactly. Because the text explicitly moves the spotlight from the border to internal governance. Housing, schools, hospitals, labor markets. It demands that states build resilient, scalable public services. The new demographic reality requires a new baseline of civic infrastructure. Governing migration successfully means integrating it structurally into our economies, rather than obsessing over repelling it at the threshold.
And I read the text as a stark warning about the breaking point of those very institutions. The question of how much pressure can European states absorb is rhetorical. It implies the limit is fast approaching.
A warning sign.
Exactly. Social cohesion, political trust, and public services are inherently fragile. They will fracture if states ignore the physical and economic limits of what they can responsibly absorb. Governance cannot be divorced from border control, because a state that cannot limit demographic inflows cannot possibly plan, fund, or maintain its internal welfare systems.
This tension between limitless adaptation and mathematical reality is perhaps the defining challenge of modern statecraft. It perfectly captures a paradigm shift in real time, forcing us to ask whether the concept of institutional capacity should be treated as a flexible baseline that must be courageously expanded, or a rigid limit that dictates the maximum acceptable pressure a society can bear.
It really does reflect the deep value of analyzing these structural shifts from multiple perspectives. There is so much more to explore in how modern societies balance demographic shifts with the inherent fragility of their welfare systems. It's a delicate balance of compassion, economics, and, well, cold hard math.
It certainly appears to be. The text leaves us looking at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly challenging. When a system is subjected to a structural stress test, it reveals exactly where the breaking points are.
Yes, it does.
The question isn't whether the pressure exists. It certainly does. The disturbing question we leave you to weigh is how much pressure can a society absorb before the very foundations of its consensus begin to crack?
A question without an easy answer, and one that requires us to look far beyond the border.
Indeed. We've reached the end of this analysis. If this added value, please like and subscribe to Strategic Labs. See you